Okay, so the webinar has begun and is being recorded.
Hi, and this is Dan Pasamanik, and this is the HP committee meeting. We are still pulling everybody together, so welcome, and we will officially get started shortly.
Wonderful, and welcome Kim Savage, welcome Eric.
Well, now I feel as if we may be ready to get started.
It's great. Yeah, now we have most folks. Yeah, well, welcome Tammy, welcome Rich.
Hello, I apologize for the late connection.
Not at all.
It's perfectly fine.
Is this a good time for housekeeping?
I think so. I think this is a great housekeeping, and then I'll take the roll after housekeeping.
Cool, thank you. Welcome committee members, liaisons, members of the public to the Homelessness Prevention Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We will begin now. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We're using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please type, "I have a comment" or "I have a question" into the chat, and a meeting message will be sent to the host. Alternatively, you can also use the raise hand feature. In the efforts of transparency for all those joining the public meeting, whether by phone or Zoom, we request that you refrain from having side conversations on chat about the content of the meeting. Again, the chat feature is utilized simply as a tool for you to virtually indicate that you'd like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. Going forward, all commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website, so you can relive the moment. A friendly reminder that this is a video conference, and please be aware of your surroundings behind you. For those of you,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I thought you finished.
For those using Zoom on a computer, when on mute, holding down the space bar will temporarily unmute you. If you use your phone to dial into this meeting, please be sure to use your computer's microphone. Please be sure your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback. And when joining, audio via computer is highly recommended. If an individual loses audio, you can call in separately using the conference number. Thank you very much. Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And before I turn it over to our chair, I wanted to say on behalf of the State Bar staff, a very, very warm welcome to today's the first day of the new term for the commission. So a very warm welcome to new commissioner Tammy Mahoney, who now sits on the Homelessness Prevention Funds Committee. Also, we're very excited to have existing Commissioner Jim Meeker slide into the role of committee chair. And that is because our outgoing committee chair has been appointed to be the co-vice chair of the entire commission. That's Chris Schreiber. And I would like to say thank you very, very much to Christian Schreiber for his leadership of the committee, and of course on his new leadership role on the commission, for all the hard work that you've been doing and that you're about to do. And thank you to Jim. So welcome, Tammy. Thank you, Chris. And then thank you, Jim, for becoming our new committee chair. And Jim, if you like, I can do the role now.
Okay, go ahead.
Meeker.
Here.
Aflagi.
Here.
Al-Saraf is intending to be absent. Iskin.
Here.
Oh, there's Rhinus.
Here.
Savage.
Here.
And Schreiber.
Here.
And yeah, we have a quorum, Jim.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to also take the opportunity to welcome Tammy, and also to thank Christian for his excellent leadership, and congratulations on moving up into the hierarchy of the commission. Right. And so I guess the first thing we do is
do we want to run through roll for any of the other people who might be in attendance?
Oh my gosh, that's my oversight.
Like
Oh, thank you, Dan. I'm sorry, Jim. Yeah, I jumped the gun. We do have liaisons and other staff members.
Quorum,
Let me actually just close the attendance sheet and try and reopening it. Thank you for checking that. Okay. I've reloaded the spreadsheet. Yeah, and sorry again, Jim, for my cutting that short too soon. Okay, so allow me to call out our liaisons. Selena Copeland from LAC. Bonnie Huff from the Judicial Council.
I'm here, thank you.
Bonnie. Christine Ganong, the Board of Trustees liaison. And then Mark Toney, also Board of Trustees liaison. Okay.
And Chris, I was not recorded in that first one, but
Yeah, I was sort of presuming from the announcement prior to that, but yeah, that was a presumption on my part. I didn't actually hear your voice say that you were present in the earlier. Although I did mark
you as present, Tammy. But thank you for noting for the record that you're here. I appreciate that. All right, and then for State Bar staff, Dwan Nguyen.
Here, thank you.
Chris McConkey is here. Danielle McRae.
here.
Daniel Pasamenik. Here. Brady Dewar.
Oh, I totally saw him.
I see Brady is here. Yeah. And Donna Hershkowitz. Okay, I don't see Donna.
Sorry, Chris, it's Brady. I had some trouble getting the mute off.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you, Brady. Okay, and then this completes the complete roll call. Thank you, Jim, for letting me continue with that. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so I guess the first thing is minutes, and after minutes, we'll ask for public comment. The only corrections or suggestions for correction, and it doesn't have to be done, I would have on the minutes is on page 4 at the end of the second paragraph that summarizing Bonnie's statement on the evidence-based research practices that she had mentioned before, a couple of studies that she was relying on. And I guess this is the academic in me, but I suggest that we actually footnote those studies specifically. In particular, since during that discussion part of the meeting that there was some issue by some members about what is evidence-based research. And I know that she was relying on certain published studies for that statement. So I don't know, Bonnie, if you could give us those studies for footnote purposes?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so.
Okay. So do we have any other suggestions or changes to the minutes? Okay, hearing none, can we have a roll call vote for approval?
Yes, and who would like to make the motion? Jim?
I'll actually make the motion.
Great. Thank you, Lansha. And then Chris seconded. All right, and I'll call the vote. Meeker?
Yes.
Aflagi?
Yes.
And Alsaroff is absent. Iskin?
Yes.
Mahoney?
I would believe I would have no vote on that.
Yes, I can record you as an abstain.
Abstain, please.
Rhinus?
Yes.
Savage?
Yes.
And Schreiber?
Yes.
Motion carries.
And just for the record, the motion that I have here is just approval of the meeting summary. But what we're really talking about is as amended to include the footnoted your reference materials, right?
That's correct. That would have been my motion. I think Chris was seconding that. Thank you for the clarity, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. All right, yeah, so the motion carries, and staff will insert as a footnote the cited sources that Bonnie sends to staff. All right, and then the next item on the agenda, Jim, is staff's report on HP3 Homelessness Prevention 3 Formula Application Review, followed by staff's recommendation.
Right, I think what, Dan, you're presenting that?
We're not doing public comment. There's a person, there's a caller.
Oh, there is.
Thank you, Kim.
I'll allow them to talk. I'm not sure who the person is. Hello, caller.
And the caller may or may not have a public comment. They might just be listening. But this is your phone number begins with 323, and if you'd like to make a public comment, subject to Jim's approval, we could take the public comment now.
Sure, there is a comment.
I see no indication that they want to talk.
That's great. So let's we can rescind the permission to speak, and if we convert it, and then note for the record that there's no public comment at this time.
And Chris, your PowerPoint's like really clean, so I'm like perfectly happy for you to present it. If there's any slides you want me to talk through, I'm happy to do that. However you want to split that up.
All right, great. So yeah, we'll proceed to staff's report. I'll go ahead and share my screen then. Thank you, Dan.
Sure.
Moment. My computer is very slowly entering slideshow mode. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. The staff report and recommendation pertains to agenda item number 4A, which is to discuss and approve eligibility for 2021 through 2024 homelessness prevention, aka HP3 or homeless prevention 3 formula grants. And then co-presenting with me will be Dwan and Daniel. Dan.
I should just go by Dan now because between me and
now
Danielle,
we have a Danielle.
Yeah, we need to be agile.
And Danielle, you're also welcome to jump in whenever you like. So I'll just cover. It's a rather short presentation because the committee members, I think, have seen a lot of this information multiple times now. But so that it tells a complete story, we'll do a quick overview of AB 164 with an emphasis on just how the formula grants were different than the competitive grants, since today's meeting is about the formula grants, including one update on the grant parameters. I'll point out where we are in the HP3 formula grant making timeline. A quick refresher on what the application asked about, sort of what the philosophy of the application, the approach we took, how staff reviewed applications, and then I will put forward staff's recommendation, which is also in the posted meeting materials. It's part of Dan's October 1 memo. And then we have a proposed resolution for the very end when the committee is ready, upon the conclusion of discussion, when the committee is ready to vote. So just as a quick refresher, Assembly Bill 164 created these grants by amending the Budget Act of 2021. It provides $40 million in the most recent Budget Act of federal funds. It provides it to the Judicial Council to administer through the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission for Homelessness Prevention legal services. We expect that an additional $40 million will become available in the next 2 years. And as such, the commission has voted to make one batch of 3-year awards with the formula funding and one batch of approximately 3-year awards with the competitive grant funding for total statewide funding over 3 years of $80 million. AB 164 states that is to fund QLSPs, Qualified Legal Services Projects and Support Centers, to provide homelessness prevention. Today, we're going to be talking about the eligibility for formula grants, which is the bulk of the appropriation. So it's after admin costs, it's 75% of the funds will go out by formula grant, and the 3-year total is $58,500,000. The other 25% goes out by competitive grants, and the committee will be meeting on October 29th to advance the competitive awards. Currently, that application window is still open. As a quick reminder as to what the programs, QLSPs and support center applicants were allowed to apply to do or to propose. The grants are to fund eviction defense, other tenant defense assistance, and landlord-tenant rental disputes, or services to prevent foreclosure for homeowners. Just a reminder that that particular item in the list is new this year, including pre-eviction and eviction legal services, counseling, advice and consultation, mediation training, renter education and representation, as well as legal services to improve habitability, increasing affordable housing, ensuring receipt of eligible income or benefits to improve housing stability. And then also new this year, legal help for persons displaced because of domestic violence and homelessness prevention. The grant parameters for the formula grants, almost all these slides just talk about the formula grants. The grant parameters overlap in some ways with the competitive awards. Some requirements were unique to the formula grants. So two of the requirements that were unique to the formula awards, so these do not apply to the competitive ones, is that the QLSP and Support Center applicants must already be performing one or more of the permissible activities, homelessness prevention activities that these grants would fund. And they have to have been found eligible for 2021 IOLTA funding. The statute provides that they will receive, that eligible applicants will receive their share of the HP3 formula funds will be equal to, the percent will be equal to that applicant's 2021 IOLTA allocation divided by the total 21 IOLTA allocation for all programs eligible for the HP3 formula funding. So it's a very specific formula that staff will apply. It does specify that each eligible applicant will get at least $50,000 per year unless they elect a lesser amount. They may not use the funds, HP3 formula funds, to supplant any other funding. So the intention is to expand services or perhaps to save services that would otherwise be ending. And then a clarification from the legislature is that HP3 clients, both formula and competitive grant clients, should be statutorily indigent pursuant to Business Profession Code 6213D, and that's the same indigency definition that the legislature uses for IOLTA and EAF grants, interest on loans, trust accounts, and equal access fund grants.
Is that 200% of poverty line now, or was that changed?
It's still at 125% of federal poverty, receipt of SSI, and qualifies for Older Americans Act funding and I think Developmental Disability Act funding. But the legislation that would raise it to 200% of federal poverty, Assembly Bill 498, I think, is on the governor's desk. I don't know if Selena has joined, but I'm sure LAC has been tracking it really closely. It had passed both chambers of the state legislature, and I think it was presented for signature. And I think the signs are pointing to the governor's office supports it. I think it is
or that it would become law
uncontroversial.
without, or that it would become law without a signature. I think that's like one of the two options.
Oh, interesting. I'm actually
that
unsure
is one of the
about
two options. We were expecting a signature yesterday, but when we checked, sometimes it takes a little bit of time on Leg Info to update. So when Selena and I text back and forth yesterday, I hadn't been updated yet. So
yeah, sometimes there's a 1 or 2 day delay on the legislature's official website for tracking the status of bills. It would take, I'm unsure if it's urgency legislation, but I assume it's not, and it would therefore become effective on January 1st. But it would amend the definition in the Business Professions Code. So to the extent that HP3 clients need to meet that definition to qualify for these services, it would as soon as it amended the code, it would be the eligibility threshold would raise to 200% for these grants. So it doesn't matter that these grants will be signing these grant agreements, this calendar year if it becomes effective on January 1st. And
just one point, Chris, that changes eligibility for clients, but it doesn't change. It won't change from the 125 for the formula for calculating resources, right?
That's correct.
That is correct. Yeah. So here's where we're at in the grant making timeline for formula awards. So October 1, the committee's meeting today to vote on eligibility. This is a authority that the full commission delegated to the committee on August 13th to approve eligibility. Staff will then run the AB 164 formula for HP3 formula grants. We wait to run the formula because, if a program is ineligible, we will remove them from the formula. It changes how much everyone would get. So we intend to run the allocations next week, and then we will release the budget forms as quickly as possible to give the eligible applicants as much time as we can to create their budgets. So we propose, and the committee previously recommended, we give them about 3 weeks to submit their budgets. So those would come in on about October 29. commission delegated authority to staff to review the budgets to make sure that they match the deliverables in the application and there's no concerns. And then the grant period would begin on December 1st. It's a somewhat accelerated timeline to be responsive to AB 164's requirement that the commission administer the funds as soon as practicable, quote unquote. So that's why there was a delegation of authority to the committee to approve eligibility and staff to approve the budgets. So the application, as the committee knows, we tried to keep it as similar, staff tried to keep it as similar as possible to the application questions for HP1 and HP2, again, to expedite the process so we could launch the application as quickly as possible and get the funds out as soon as practicable. So it asks the HP1, 2, and 3 applications ask about the organization's current services eligibility. Again, for the formula grants, they have to currently be doing one or more of those authorized activities, their qualifications to do the proposed work, their plan to avoid supplanting existing funding. And then as far as the proposed project, the application asks about the clients, including their income eligibility, the proposed intervention, homelessness prevention interventions, the proposal's goals. The applicants have to specify quarterly activities. So for this one, they had to do it, for the approximately 3-year award, to detail the staffing and then also to describe an evaluation strategy. So staff, OA and I, Office of Access and Inclusion staff reviewed all of the applications. 75 programs applied, 61 qualified legal services projects and 14 support centers. Staff screened carefully for eligibility, threshold eligibility, so to make sure they were a 2021 IOLTA EAF grantee and that they currently provide one or more of these services. There was an application question about that. And staff evaluated the sufficiency of their responses about things like permissible activities. Was there at least one item in the AB 164's list that they were focusing on? The sufficiency of their supplantation response, non-supplantation responses, and all other aspects of their application to ensure the applications were complete. They didn't skip any questions, and it's sufficiently detailed. All applicants have also signed project assurances. And those are, I think it's a list of 9 assurances, and among them are things like, its standard assurances are, if we got this award, we would use these funds only for statutorily permissible purposes, we would not discriminate, we would not supplant, etc. So all of them had an executive and a board contact sign an assurances document. Staff needs to raise to the committee today that one program applied late. It was about 2 business days, approximately 4 calendar days late, and that's Alameda County Homeless Action Center. The deadline to apply was Friday, September 10th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And if I remember correctly, they applied on Tuesday at 11:59 a.m. So about 2 days late. And staff, the next slide is staff's recommendation, but to preview it for you, and this is in the memo, staff will recommend in just a moment that the committee accept this late application. Staff did have to follow up with some organizations whose either like copy and pasted the wrong answer into the wrong question on the application, or maybe that they only wrote a couple of sentences and we needed a little bit more detail to be able to make a recommendation of eligibility. We were able to complete that follow-up with that I think like dozen or so programs in the week between when we posted the memo and today. And I can let Dwan and Dan jump in here if I accidentally mischaracterize this, but my understanding is all of those programs satisfactorily clarified or otherwise revised their application to confirm, so that staff can confirm their recommendation of eligibility for them. But we had grouped them in the memo into like 3 categories. One was some we needed them to clarify the scope of services to make sure that it was going to be narrowly tailored to homelessness prevention. There might have been a project, for instance, where it was mostly homeless prevention, but we weren't sure if something else would sneak in. So we asked them to confirm and clarify that it would be homelessness prevention focused. We had another bucket of programs with whom we followed up. We needed a little bit more detail about their non-supplantation language. And then there were a few that we just kind of called like to gather additional detail because maybe the response was rather short. Would you add anything, Dwan or Dan?
No, they're
follow-up.
mainly technical cleanups. That's why, pending anything kind of major additional updates from, we knew we were moving that direction of recommending approval. But yeah, all those technical issues have now been resolved.
I would only say that we followed the kind of game plan that we've already mentioned of using the same definition of eligible services and indigency that we use for IOLTA programs and EAF programs generally. There were a couple of programs that have some systemic responses, and they were like appropriately focused on indigent concerns. They were taken up due to their relationship to indigent populations, and they were aligned with everything else that was going on. So, we just use the same standard there as we would have for any other program.
Hey, Chris, could you remind me again what non-supplantation means? I'm sorry, I've kind of losing the
yeah, it's kind of like
about that.
technical too. So so Assembly Bill 164 specifies that for both the formula and the competitive grants, and I think this ended up being true for HP1 and HP2 as well, that the grant should expand the organization. It should avoid supplanting existing funding at the organization, with the ostensible goal of expanding the organization's services in homelessness prevention, or otherwise saving their services if the funding was going to be going away. So rather than just sort of moving money around at the org, it would actually be an incentive maybe to hire staff to do more homelessness prevention work, for instance. So because it's a express requirement, the application requires the program to explain and sign an assurance saying that they won't use the grant if they get it to supplant existing funding.
So if they were doing a homelessness program with earlier homelessness prevention funding, could they continue that program with this funding?
They could, if when the funding ends. So for their homelessness prevention 1 grant, for instance, that grant has come to a close because that grant ended on June 30th. They could apply, and I think some did, to continue that project with HP3 funds. For homelessness prevention 2, they're less than 1 year into a 3-year grant, so they wouldn't have been able to apply to use their HP3 grant to continue HP2 project, unless they were proposing to expand the work.
Can I just say, yeah, I think Chris definitely got it. The basic idea is, so for example, if they have been providing housing assistance with IOLTA funding, they can't say, oh, well, we're going to use the housing money now instead of the IOLTA funding. That would be supplanting because they already were providing that service using using the initial funding. So the goal that the legislature has set out is to expand services rather than, for example, shifting the IOLTA funding and being able to do family law or do some other kinds of things. So it's a pretty common concept in state grants.
Okay. And then almost done with staff's report. I think this is our last slide before the proposed resolution. So just a couple more things to point out about staff's review, and Dan detailed this really well in his memo. When staff was reviewing the applications, we just wanted to point out that staff found in review that when programs were proposing to use their HP3 formula funds to help clients receive means-tested public benefits, the nexus or connection to homelessness prevention was rather clear. Means-tested public benefits are generally available only to people who are very, very low income, such that any increase in income is going to increase or contribute to their housing stability. There were a very small number of proposals, I don't even remember the number, but I feel like it was 1 or 2 or 3, where they had put in some other types of public benefits, like I think maybe Social Security, disability insurance, or something that aren't strictly means tested. So staff did follow up with those programs to make sure that it was going to be focused on homelessness prevention work for very low income Californians. So staff just wanted to flag that was sort of there was a functional presumption that a means tested public benefit contributed to housing stability. And I believe, and I wasn't here when this happened, but I believe that was also a functional presumption for HP1 and HP2. And staff also wanted to flag that for the responses about, although every program did submit a thoughtful response on about how they would avoid supplantation. So they might have said, well, we'll hire new staff, or that this project has funding that came to an end. Staff did put a lot of weight on the fact that each applicant submitted a duly signed assurance document with their ED signed it, and I think it required the board chair to sign it or board president to sign it, saying, also attesting that they wouldn't supplant funding, and staff puts a lot of weight on those assurances in recommending to the committee today that all of the applicants be found eligible.
I would only add to that this memo is maybe a little bit more alarmist than it might have been under less compressed circumstances. Given that we're trying to get the money out as quickly as possible, we posted this and then kept on resolving some stuff. So we're sharing things that if we'd had another week, we would not have brought up.
That's a really great point. Yeah, because so to facilitate a December 1st disbursement date, like Dan just said, we kind of turned around the memo right upon the conclusion of application review. Normally, our grant making timeline probably would have provided staff with a week or two to do this sort of technical assistance follow up and ask a program, hey, would you clarify this? We think this is what you were meaning to describe, but the words you chose didn't quite do that. Instead, we had to post the memo and say we would do what follow up we were doing. So I love that observation. It might have sounded a bit more alarmist, but then staff would have intended. The one caveat I do, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Quick question on this supplantation. All of these agencies have to provide an outside audit yearly in order to qualify for the IOLTA funds, right? And would those audits ever address that issue specifically?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so most programs to continue to qualify for IOLTA funding do have to submit independently audited financial statements. If their revenue is under a certain amount, they can submit financial reviews instead. All I can do is speak in my experience as a previous director of finance at a nonprofit, is that auditors typically don't check routinely check for like grant terms like non-supplantation clauses. In my limited experience, it would be like a little too detailed to get caught in an audit sweep. But maybe if someone else has a different experience or observation.
Chris, this is Rich. Would it be appropriate for us to suggest to the grant recipients that in future audits of their entities as recipients of this grant, that the auditors look into that and render an opinion with respect to supplantation?
Oh, Dwan, raise your hand. So I'm wondering if you have a response right away.
I don't have a response on Rich's suggestion right now, but I am working with our fiscal team, Michael and Carolina primarily, to see whether when we go out on our monitoring visits, there's a way for us to ensure that the no supplantation. So we're still in the design of that. So I wonder if we're able to check that on our end. Would we need to work with their auditors to do that? I know that there was a program that you all probably recall that we did a little bit more of a deeper dive with, and we did ask their auditors, but that is costly for programs. So we're trying to figure out on our end whether we do we could save them some money, whether it's just built into our monitoring. And I don't have quite the answer to that yet. We're working out a lot of kind of technical things with the federal money, working with Judicial Council to make sure that all our T's are crossed and all our I's. So this is one of the areas. So I can report back to both the larger commission and the executive committee and this committee once we have a little bit more information. And if we're not able to, then maybe we can then explore, would be my suggestion, then explore whether we want to require programs to build into their audit. I just know that then that would be an additional cost for them.
I love that idea, and it might come down to, I think, the Office of Access and Inclusion staff can share whatever guidance for the annual audited financial statement production, it best contributes to our grant making. It might end up coming down to like what the auditor, the specific auditor will or won't include in their scope of work. So it might end up just being like a recommendation or a suggestion. But Dan?
I also, wanted to note that supplantation relates to all funds, not just ours. So if, to the extent that anything we impose is limited to the funds we give, we're going to only get a partial picture. And a lot of times these are going to be internal budgeting decisions where they have an internal fund that they can allocate to a couple of different program areas, unless their audit is already broken down into program areas and you can cross-reference somehow which fund is funding which one of those. That's a level of auditing I very rarely, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen that presented to us, or even like in organizational materials that get reviewed by boards. So we might want to like just make sure that they're doing the right thing rather than like hand us something in particular.
Yeah, Rich, you see your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to add to that these are 3-year grants. And if after the first year you were to find a grant recipient had violated, for want of a better term, the supplantation restriction and its certification that there would be no supplantation, would we then suspend the balance of the 3-year grant?
That's a great question. I'm thinking on the spot how we would enforce a grant
I
compliance.
think we would come back to this committee, and at that time, staff would probably have a proposal to you and options.
Yeah.
Then the committee would decide, would be how I think that it would play out. If we were ever in discovery that, even though they had signed a grant agreement and project assurance saying there's no supplantation, but if we were under information that it was otherwise, we would definitely bring that information back to you all to decide course of action.
I could imagine, depending on the circumstances too, how staff crafted that recommendation. I could imagine a situation where maybe because a lot of these grantees are just very honest and sometimes will bring accidental noncompliance to our attention. They will say like, we are so sorry, but we just discovered during a staffing turnover that this might have happened. What would you like us to do? And so I can imagine we would collect the facts of what happened, and maybe we would come to the committee to explain it and make a recommendation at that time. So it's just trying to remember if there's any other questions about any of this, but I do want to make one more caveat before we dive into staff's recommendation and answer all the remaining questions, which is just that the clarification from the legislature that HP3 formula and competitive grants should support only services to statutorily indigent Californians is a rather recent clarification. We happen to get that clarification after the deadline to apply. So staff is having reviewed all of the applications and reviewed the scope of work and having already ascertained a strong nexus to homelessness prevention in every application. Staff is confident that every single applicant will be able to meet that clarified expectation, but staff still proposes as part of the 3-week budgeting process to follow up with any applicant who might have described some services to non-indigent Californians, because at the time they applied, the guidance was that was okay, because for HP2 it was okay. And just to confirm for them that the legislature has made this clarification and that to remain eligible for this funding, they will have to assure us that the grant will indeed be spent only on services to indigent Californians. And to the extent they feel like that they need to revise a deliverable to reflect that, we propose to let them make that technical revision. So that their assurance that they will spend the funds on only statutorily indigent Californians is consistent with what they propose to do. And that would be something that the timeline kind of forces us to do that as part of the budgeting process when we're reviewing their budgets. We think it will be really quick, the follow-up, but the clarification came so recently that we weren't able to complete that before today's meeting. Dewan, Dan, would you characterize that any differently?
Yeah, and I have to say from my review of the ones that said that they were going to be serving over 125%, it wasn't the entirety of the grant, it was a sliver of their project, and it was to serve perhaps somebody over 125 that had an additional access need or was worthy of services because of a language issue or some other barrier. So we don't anticipate an issue, and again, a technical cleanup, and we are already organized and prepared to contact them next week and have them just revise that portion of the application.
I would say yes to what both Dwan and Chris have said, and also in a lot of these cases, they're talking about people who are up to 200%, which we're expecting to change really, momentarily. So that's not even going to be an issue. And in several of the other cases, strangely enough, they're saying that these are over income seniors, which statutorily don't exist. So we are going to use this as an opportunity to reach out to some programs and let them know that anybody who's eligible for OAA funded services is considered to be indigent under the statute. You can stop worrying about it, and we'll get them to change those answers so that it says what it's supposed to.
Yeah, the context for Dan's point he just made is that the way the question was worded on the application was, do you have might you use any of these funds to serve non-indigent Californians? And then Dan just observed, some of them were like, yeah, well, our regular clients are seniors or something. And well, maybe it would be helpful for us to clarify is that actually those are within the definition of statutorily, or a definition of indigent person. But
I ran
really
into it a
not
couple
that
times
many
yesterday on a
programs.
site visit too, on a monitoring. Staff were just like coming up with this, and I just like made a mental note and brought it back to the executive director. It's like, really? It's out there somewhere, so we'll just clean it up every time we see it.
Yeah. So it was great. Thank you, Dan. And that's it. Every application was focused on poverty alleviation, so that's why staff is not concerned about this sort of like technical, giving them the opportunity to revise if necessary to reflect a clarification that arrived after the deadline to apply. So that's staff's recommendation. I should say a quick something about the late arriving application from Homeless Action Center. The reason, and Dwan, feel free to jump in if you want to elaborate on this, but the reason that when staff was reviewing that late application, staff wanted to recommend accepting it, notwithstanding its lateness, was the twofold. So the circumstances of their submitting it late was a simple misunderstanding on their part as to whether or not they qualified for that grant. They were intending to apply for the HP3 competitive grant, and I think that they thought that it might have been one or the other, or that the HP3 formula grant, like they could only, they would have had to apply to do a different kind of project than they wanted to do. It was through the scope of routine technical assistance to them, and they were asking us about the HP3 competitive grant, that we discovered that they erroneously thought they didn't qualify for the Formula One. And so when we explained that to them, they expressed strong interest in still submitting an application, even though it'd be late. And they did it as quickly as they possibly could. I think they turned it around in like a business day. The other reason staff, and maybe the main reason staff recommends accepting it, is doing so would just expand the reach of AB 164 via an organization that focuses almost exclusively on homelessness prevention and poverty alleviation. So the work that they would do would be really important. And staff didn't want to see AB 164 miss the clients that they would serve with this funding. Dwan, is there anything you add to rationale?
Chris and I had met with them the week after that Monday to talk about their competitive grant. And in talking to them, we asked them, well, what are your formula activities? And they really just thought they didn't qualify. And so at that time, they expressed an interest to want to apply. So we opened it up and they got it in as quick as they possibly could. And the core services are definitely squarely within qualifying activities. So we don't see a problem substantively.
And since it was a formula grant, unlike a competitive grant, where the formula grant is sort of designed to try and allow as many QSPs and support centers as can meet the eligibility requirements to get the funding. We kind of thought that if it was a competitive grant, the situation might be different. Maybe I don't think we could make the same recommendation. So the next slide is just staff's proposed resolution, I think. So I'll leave this slide up, but really the rest of the time is just to answer the committee members' questions about staff's memo. If you read through any of the profile sheets, we're available to answer questions you might have had about a particular application, because all the application reviewers are in this meeting. But we'll turn it over to the committee now.
Can you talk about the convening a bit?
Oh, I think we'd love to. Yeah, so that's the convening, and this one really, like Danielle, Dwan jump in. Bonnie was there. Chris did the welcoming remarks. So the September 21st convening was especially for the HP3 competitive grant. As the committee members may remember, and we fill Tammy in on this as well, the legislature expressed a strong interest in seeing at least the competitive grants feature really robust partnerships, especially sub-grant relationships. And so as a way to sort of facilitate that and actually encourage that through the grant making process, the State Bar, the Judicial Council, and LAC co-hosted a really well-attended gathering. I actually don't remember exactly how many people registered for it, but I want to say the high watermark might have been during the keynote address, which was Assembly Member Jesse Gabriel's opening remarks. I think we were around 90 to 100 participants at that moment, and then it had pretty steady attendance all the way to when we went to the breakout sessions at the end. I think we still were in like the 70 to 80 range, which was really good. Well, I thought it was a very successful event. It featured a great opening remarks by Chris Schreiber, a really kind and thoughtful keynote address by Assemblymember Gabriel, two really engaging panels, one the State Bar organized, one LAC organized, and then really well-attended breakout rooms to facilitate partnerships. So I don't know what my colleagues would say about it.
I'll just add, because I facilitated one of the regional breakout sessions, the one that was Southern California, but non-LA. So it caught the Inland Empire region and San Diego. And we had just a really, really great kind of discussion. People were kind of trading thoughts. And then afterwards, I got questions about, do you know a particular, community-based, program in a certain region? And I didn't off the top of my head, but I was able to, at least the questions that came through, connect them to other people that might know. So we'll see from the project proposals. I'm really, really curious to see if there are actually any fruitful kind of partnerships that came out from the convening. I know it definitely got people thinking and talking. So we'll see that it actually it is going to result in anything.
And I think that that's true, not just at the convening, but afterwards. I've heard ever since then, really just a lot of gratitude for having provided that forum to have the conversation start, and for encouraging them to go forward. Whether or not something specific and concrete happens, a lot of organizations have been appreciative that the bar and all of the stakeholders have supported that direction.
Thank you, Dwan. Thank you, Dan. Bonachet, so raise your hand.
Actually, I will go after Danielle, since she's staff and she was a big role, played a big role.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was just to say that we put out a survey to gather feedback after the convening, and I was actually looking at it earlier today because we closed the survey yesterday. And to reiterate Dan's point, we had overwhelmingly positive feedback to the commission through that survey. We asked folks to rate different parts of the convening or gathering on a scale of 1 to 5, and it was 4s and 5s across the board for really every part of the agenda. So I think it was really, really well received by the folks that attended.
Thank you, Danielle. Bonachet.
Just from the commission perspective, I had an opportunity, of course, Christian was there and Kim Savage to represent the commission. I had an opportunity just to be there for about an hour, hour and a half, but a few takeaways: really well attended, a strong showing of the collaboration of the Judicial Council and the office and LAC coming together on this important work at this important critical time. And I was taken by the fact that the Assemblyman is a true ally on these issues, and someone that we can, collaborate potentially with ongoingly on these issues. So that stayed with me, and I wanted to make sure that I shared it out with all of you in the subcommittee.
So much, Kim.
Just more compliments really to the staff. I just thought it was really, really well done. It was so tightly put together. And I think the Assemblyman's presence and his articulation of his passion and commitment, I think was terrific for everybody involved. For us going forward with more funding, I think it probably made the programs feel that they're actually valued and that their work is valued. So I just thought it was a complete success. And I'm looking forward to seeing some innovative stuff.
The one program feature I actually forgot to list, but was really important, was there was also a short presentation by Kelly Jarvis, and I think her organization is NPC Research. Okay, everyone's nodding, good. And she spoke about, she did kind of like a really quick primer on evidence-based strategies, since the federal government has emphasized a desire to see evidence-based interventions in HP3. A lot of programs and staff aren't totally sure about what that means, and she talked about what that means. And about how there's a basis in evidence for the effectiveness of full scope representation was the other piece. Yeah, so so thank you for asking about that, Chris. And as a reminder for everyone, the HP3 competitive grants were originally due at the end of, they were originally due today, October 1st, but we pushed back the deadline by 3 weeks so that we could do that stakeholder gathering. Any other questions about staff's recommendation or anything you read in the memo or any of the profile sheets if you had a chance to read any of the profile sheets? I actually had a question for Dwan. It's a little bit of live wordsmithing. Did we want to put in our resolution, because I think we drafted this resolution before the legislative clarification, do we want to say anything like subject to confirmation from the grantees that they will limit services to statutorily indigent Californians or anything? That's the only thing that's changed since we drafted this. I mean, the reality is they all basically submit an application that already articulates that. So it's like not, I'm worried about overstating like the significance.
I don't think we need it. I mean, okay. I'm confident they'll all revise their application to be eligible. And if there's an issue, then we will let the committee know. So
great. Yeah, putting it in there almost elevates it to the point where it looks like there's a risk that they won't be eligible when I don't think that's
since we've already looked at them and resolved that at this point it really just does look like wordsmithing on their part. It doesn't seem like something that needs to be elevated. If we were seeing something during that review, and we have done a review of all of them, that made me think that this was something that might be an issue going forward, maybe we should say something, but it just doesn't look like one at all.
I would concur with Dwan and Dan's assessment. So staff would not revise its resolution that it proposed in the memo. So this is from the last page of the memo.
Yeah, the memo is still totally accurate.
So just procedurally at this point, would Jim like us to move based on staff's proposal?
Before we move, I just want to make sure that there's no public comment to be considered. Do we still have the outside listener?
Let's see, thank you so much, Jim, for asking that. We do still have our outside listeners. So to our one member of the public, and you joined by phone, so it's your number starts with 323. If you'd like to make a public comment, the chair will hear you. And feel free to use the raise hand feature to indicate you'd like to make a public comment, or you can chat. Actually, since they're joining by phone, I'm not totally sure it's easy to use the same feature by your phone. So maybe I might have to just unmute them to let them, let's try unmuting them one more time. All right, you're unmuted.
Fantastic. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to the phone earlier to unmute. It's just Will, and I have no comment at this time. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Normally when you join, you're joining with your computer, I think, so we can see it's your name, but it's your.
Yeah. I'm watching my daughter today, so I just had to do speakerphone. Thank you, though.
Of course, yeah, everyone. Tammy, Will is also on the commission. He just doesn't sit on this committee. So, all right, great. Thank you, Jim, for thinking to ask.
Okay, so if there's no further comment, can we entertain a motion?
So moved.
I'll second that.
Great. Was it, I'm sorry, was it Eric or Rich that moved?
Rich moved.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll call the vote. Meeker.
Yes.
Aflagi?
Yes.
And I think Alsaroff still isn't here. Iskin?
Yes.
Mahoney?
Yes.
Rhinus?
Yes.
Savage?
Yes.
And Schreiber?
Yes.
Motion carries. Okay, so thank you very much for reviewing the memo, asking those great questions. Jim, the other item that was on our agenda was kind of a placeholder item. It was in case staff needed to make a report on the HP3 competitive grants. If the legislature had clarified something that was going to change it, which they haven't, we could use that up. That we would have agendized it, so we would have been allowed to talk about it. But I don't think we do have a report for HP3 competitive, so that would conclude staff's reports, and I think also the business items on the agenda.
The agenda, yeah. So it sounds like we're finished early, right?
Yeah, 2 hours early. And by the way, we really appreciate you holding the large block of time. When we scheduled the meeting, we weren't sure if there were going to be eligibility issues that would require committee level discussion of individual applications. And fortunately, everyone submitted a really great application. So we ended up not needing to elevate, other than the late arriving one, any particular program's proposal.
Again, with the delegation of authority, we really erred on the side of padding the schedule, raising things that we wouldn't have otherwise mentioned because they get resolved, and giving us more time to talk about them than we maybe even needed, just because we wanted to make sure that we covered everything. And that way we were sure that there wouldn't be anything coming up. Certainly, if we hadn't given ourselves this time, we'd have lots of issues to discuss.
We likely will use the whole time for October 29. I think that's also a 3-hour meeting, and that's the meeting for the committee to apply the HP3 competitive grant scoring rubric to a sampling of applications. And I have a few, and the more guidance the committee can provide to staff in that what we just called a calibration meeting, the more easily staff can apply the rubric to everyone else consistently, and then come back and say, like, here's how we did it, and following your guidance. So I do anticipate the next one probably will be the full amount of time.
Are we going to get? I assume we're going to get some materials in advance of that meeting so that we can come up with our own rankings.
It's very tight, Eric, because they're due like that Monday, and then staff will have to pick out 5 that are representative between big, large programs, rural, non-rural, and Jim has offered to help us select that. And then we'll email it to you, and we'll all both staff and the committee members will need to review those 5, and then that Friday meet to
It'd be a flurry.
Yeah, and we'll also post. We call it a review guide. We try to. We'll probably model it on the review guide, like sort of so there's a standard written approach to applying the rubric, just like as a reminder, here's what each row of the rubric means, and we try and make it as similar as possible to the partnership grants review guide and the provisionally licensed lawyers grants review guide, so there's some consistency. But when we post it, we'll also say, just here's what was in the RFP that explain that row of the rubric as a refresher.
So when are the grants? When are they coming in?
October 22nd.
So that's a week before our meeting.
Yeah, so staff's we'll draft the review guide in advance of that deadline, but then we will select those 5 applications like the day they come in and then post them. So there won't be a memo I think for the October 29th meeting, like the memo you had today, and like the memo you will have for the December 2nd meeting where you would actually vote on eligibility. But there would be a review guide, and then I think we're thinking 5 applications.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think that works.
They come in on a Friday, the 22nd, because they're due 5 p.m. So we're not going to be able to get it to you until the Monday. So that's why I say it's very
Oh
tight.
yeah, they do come in at the end of the day. Yeah.
They come in at the end of the day. So on
Yeah,
Monday, at some point, Monday.
Monday's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Chris, a quick follow-up, question to this. How soon do you think you'll have the review guide?
Oh, I think we'll probably be able to create it in the next 2 weeks. So if it was helpful to post the review guide a little earlier, I don't know what our posting protocol is for posting, like some things really early and some things later, but I don't think it'll take staff very long to create it.
Right, or just to be able to circulate it with the subcommittee so that we can start to get our mind space.
I love that idea.
Prior to receiving the.
It'll be ready much earlier than the applications will be.
What we can do is we'll do the review guide, which again, it's nothing that you haven't seen before. It's just based on the scoring rubric and what it would look like once you put your scores in. And we'll email them to you and then work on our end to post it. But we can certainly email that to you before you even post.
Yeah. Great. That's a great suggestion. I think
so long as it doesn't create more work for staff. That's
it's the same amount of work. It's just, and I would think it would have been ready in time for us to post it early anyway.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the committee members? Any other updates from the staff team? Okay. Well, I'm really excited to be able to give you back 2 hours.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Welcome, Tammy.
It's exciting to have you.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Right. We'll take care,
Great
everyone.
job, Jim and Chris.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for joining us, Will. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.